Thank you, Raven and Megan. Unfortunately, Raven and Megan are unable to participate in the discussion session today, but there are a couple of questions about AIM. So if there's anyone out there that might have knowledge about that process, we may ask people to speak up about that. I want to extend a thank you to everyone who presented during the session. It's been really wonderful to hear about your research and exciting too. There's such a vast array of things going on in this region relative to the land and water. And so I guess we'll start to field questions. In the question answer box, I have a question for Walter Fertig. Or it was posed during Walter's session, but others may want to field this question as well. The question is, are the gap areas protected by the overgrazing of livestock?
Yeah, hi, this is Walter. So I had to leave a little bit out in the discussion. The gap designation, there's 4 different categories based on the degree of protection or the intent of management regarding biological diversity, and then also the permanence of that protection. And so gap status 1 and 2 lands are considered more protected than gap 3 or 4 lands. Gap 3 is where it gets confusing. That tends to refer to public lands that are managed under a multiple use mandate. So it's typically national forest lands, BLM, Bureau of Land Management lands, anything that doesn't really have a formal designation like a national monument or an ACEC or RNA or something like that. Where it gets a little bit tricky is in the case of the Grand Staircase, where there's a management plan that focuses on biological diversity and other components. There are other activities that are permissible as well. Sometimes those other activities may not be great, for a particular target, and referring to like grazing or recreation or things like that. The more highly protected lands do tend to not allow some of those things, like a national park, designated wilderness area, or so forth. But they still have their activities as well. Tourism activity for certain has an impact on things. Where I was trying to get at was, if we can identify specific areas as areas of critical environmental concern, RNAs, et cetera, and then tailor management of those areas in their formal, the RMP process, the resource management plan process, or land use planning process, basically, to identify management activities such as recreation, grazing, forestry, things like that, that might have an impact on the target species. So that's where I think coming up with the designation of these special areas and then the particular management that they need is really important to make sure that some of these other activities don't interfere, I should say, with the very value that the site's being protected for. Grand Staircase is a little bit of a challenge because, like grazing activity was grandfathered in essentially under the original proclamation. And so, that management of that can be an issue. I think it's important to look at sites kind of on a case-by-case basis, though. And I think some of the rare plant sites that I pointed out very quickly are, some of them are places where there really isn't a lot of grazing impact, largely because there's no forage or water nearby. And so I would argue in those cases that it's actually relatively easy to work that into the designation of those specific areas that they're not being used anyway. And so, if they can be set aside not to be used for other purposes, then that's achieving the conservation goal for those species or whatever the target is. But I think it's really important to articulate what those targets are, where they are, and what the management needs are. And I think that has gotten lost when we look at the whole 2 million acres of Grand Staircase. And I think the same applies to some of these other areas, Bears Ears as well. If there are really specific areas that we're concerned about, I think it's important to identify those and make sure that the local management of those sites is really amenable to the whatever the target conservation goal is. I hope that answered that question.
Yeah. Thank you, Walter. So another question that came up but has been fielded, but I thought might be nice to open up to everyone is, are there opportunities for citizen scientists to get involved in the work that you're doing? And if so, how does that look?
This is Jackie. We are actually going to have a little bit of a chat tomorrow about citizen science projects on the monument and surrounding areas, and all the agencies. So in general, yes, there are opportunities. One opportunity that exists where you don't have to be part of a formal project is to use an app such as iNaturalist, which allows you to go out and make nature observations on your own. Just do it safely if you're out on the staircase or in any of those more harsh environments. But there are several programs for citizen scientists to engage with field researchers through multiple different groups, my group and the Grand Staircase-Escalante partners, and some other groups as well. But like I said, there will be a short session tomorrow talking about some of those opportunities.
Great, thank you, Jackie.
Mm-hmm.
Would anyone else like to add anything?
Yeah, and then also with our fencing surveying that we'll be doing near the Kanab area, we will be looking for volunteers, not necessarily citizen science, but looking for volunteers to come out and help with that. So we'll be looking for volunteers through probably some of our partners and me as well. So yeah, contact me, Lindsay, at wildlandsnetwork.org.
Great, thanks, Lindsay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and can I just follow up with a brief plug for using like the iNaturalist app and other things? As we're looking at underappreciated or under-recognized groups, whether they're plants or fungi or mosses, whatever they are, any documentation is potentially really valuable, not only for the scientific data, but also for creating a connection to those places. So I would encourage everyone, if there's not a formal citizen science project, make those connections by getting to know things that we typically overlook.
Great, thank you, Steve. Let me see. So there was another question that was fielded, but it did happen during the session on wildlife connectivity. So I thought maybe I would offer an opportunity for Lindsay to answer it. It was regarding the cost of wildlife safe crossings.
Yeah, so it depends on the type of structures, but the overpass structures can range between 5 and 6 million, or even more, just depending on the size of them. And I'm not sure about underpasses and the cost of those. Erin might know more.
Great, thank you, Lindsay.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. So we have a question, and this is more of a broad question. What is the average cost of material needed to perform research related to site conditions and native species, or research in general? So what is the basic tools for doing the research that you do? It's and if the person wants to elaborate on the question, they're welcome to.
I can give an answer from the lichen side of things.
Okay.
One of the arguments with using for using biomonitors such as lichens is that they are cheap, they're always out there, and there's no equipment cost, right? So for things like doing surveys and identifying potentially sensitive indicator species, these are like permanent, already established monitors out there, and all you have to do is go out and look for the presence and absence.
Mm-hmm.
Once we start doing things like elemental analysis or comprehensive field surveys, the cost jumps significantly to the scale of 1,000 anyway, to much higher per site to do a full inventory and elemental analysis. But with strategic approaches, looking for indicator species and documenting those, the cost can be kept pretty low and pretty minimal. And plus without any physical, disturbance to the site. So.
Thank you, Steve.
I'll add that a seed crew going out to collect seeds costs about $50,000 for a season. And that's for the crew to be out in the field, their vehicles, their food, the taxonomist service of the person who's going to identify all the plants and all the data entry and data analysis. So it can add up really fast.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd also emphasize Steve's point about trampling. And when you send people out in the field to do monitoring, that's a big concern.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Jackie.
Mm-hmm.
So I do have two questions that were meant for Raven and Megan about AIM. Is there anyone that might be comfortable answering some general questions about AIM? I'm afraid on that is able to speak, that is on one of the panelists. Okay. I think that maybe we'll just have to email Megan and Raven about those questions.
Sarah, I could try. Back in the day, we on the Grand Staircase, we did kind of an early version of AIM, the rangeland health assessments. It's very similar. I could try to answer the question. I didn't see that those questions in the chat.
So there are two. The first one is, does the AIM process compare data to reference sites in addition to assessing trends?
My understanding is that the reference site is an important component of these kinds of monitoring. And it certainly was the case 20 years ago, 25 years ago, when we were doing the rangeland health, kind of the predecessor version of AIM. And it's really important to calibrate people, particularly looking at ecological site areas that have been defined, to go to a good example, a reference area that is in good condition or relatively undisturbed, or has the original native component of species, or at least best matches what we think that area is supposed to look like, or what its site potential is. And the advantage of that is it gets everybody on the same page as far as, oh, okay, this is what we're looking at. This is the reference condition that ideally we want to see in these other places that we're examining, because everybody brings their own worldview, bias, whatever. In the absence of having that sort of standardization, I think it's really important.
Thank you, Walter. And the second question is, are the AIM protocols always used prior to the renewal of an allotment? And I'm not sure what they mean by that, but maybe.
Well, they're referring to so allotment. There's like on Grand Staircase, there's 100 allotments or more or less, and they're renewed on various cycles, typically 10 years, I believe. Sometimes they're longer, sometimes less, perhaps. To be renewed, those allotments are supposed to meet rangeland health standards. At least that was the case 20 years ago. I'm speaking from 20 years ago. And so part of the monitoring is to make sure that these areas are still meeting those rangeland health standards. And typically there's, in Utah at least, there used to be 4, probably going to forget one of them, but basically looking at the soil stability, the vegetation, if it's the functional groups are present that are desirable, water quality. I think there might be a pollution one as well. I'm probably misspeaking slightly, but the intent of this monitoring is to see if those conditions are still being met. If they are being met, it's typically the permit is renewed. It's when they're not being met, and then the Bureau of Land Management, the range conservationists, the permittee, they all need to get together and come up with a plan to see that those conditions are met. For the permit to be renewed. Typically the permit is renewed still, but with some provisos that they're supposed to be trying to improve the condition of the area. But I believe that's part of the intent of the AIM program, is to provide that baseline data to help make some of those management decisions.
Great. Thank you, Walter. Once you started speaking, I was like, oh yeah, of course, rangelands, grazing allotments. So thanks for answering those questions. So it looks like we've exhausted all of the questions. There is one more that just popped up. Does the BLM have the means, legal, financial, and staff-wise, to take effective steps to protect sensitive sites? I'm not sure. Is anyone able to answer that question that is a panelist? Maybe we can see if there's someone that can answer that question tomorrow. Oh, Walter, can you? Sorry, you're muted.
Thanks. I couldn't undo my mute.
Oh, darn.
Yeah. Yes, there are tools to do that. Actually, could you rephrase the question? I sort of lost my train of thought trying to unmute.
Sure. They say the question is, does the BLM have the means, legal, financial, and staff-wise, to take effective steps to protect sensitive sites?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think legally, yes, they do. And a lot of that goes back to the enabling legislation. Not to get into a long story, BLM, came as a kind of a hybrid of the public grazing office and where they're trying to disperse the public or lands, the land. I can't forget the name of it. Back in the 40s or 50s, but a lot of their driving legislation that came out in the 70s, but also goes back to the Tailored Grazing Act, where looking at different uses of those lands, and the BLM has discretion in how to manage these different things. They have the legal authority to do these sorts of things. Sometimes they need some arm twisting from the public to make sure that they do those sorts of things, and that's where it's important that people recognize that these lands, they are being managed on behalf of everyone. Sometimes it seems like they're being managed more for local folks, but they really do belong to everybody. And it's everybody's voice ought to be heard and needs to be heard and considered. Staffing is always an issue. Budgets are being cut all the time. Hopefully with some of this new stimulus kind of money will help with that. There's new monies coming in for fire management, things like that. Sometimes it's sort of crisis management monies coming in, but there is definitely a need to have more staff on the ground, natural resource staff, scientists on the ground. And that's another place where the public can make an impact. They are our servants, and we have to make our voices heard to make sure that these agencies are doing what we would like them to do.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Walter. Would anyone else like to add some content?
Hi, Sarah. I just put a couple comments in the chat.
Yeah.
But just about what he said. Sometimes, often agencies maybe even want to do what, the things we're discussing here about maybe saying the right thing, but we're often under a lot of serious pressures politically too. So not only can, the public engage with the actual agency, but to also engage with their political representation kind of on behalf of the agency can be really helpful. And then just going back to the question about costs, there are always so many extra costs behind the scenes that it's easy to forget about. But, even getting a group of people together to discuss an idea for a project or research, that costs money. Before we can approve a project or research or anything like that, we have to do NEPA on it and analyze it. That costs money and takes time. So just something good for us all to keep in mind.
Great, thank you. I appreciate that, Kendall. And it looks as though Vicki Tyler is also responding to the question about BLM having the resources to protect sensitive sites. So Scott, please do look for that response in the Q&A.